Okay, we got our normal crowd here, including the back row gang. Here they are. Okay, so we can begin. I'll spend a few minutes at the beginning trying to create some expectations about the significance of the importance, such as it is, of this lecture. I'm looking at alternative frameworks, but in this particular lecture I want to focus on Keynes. I like to get my Keynes from the general theory and not from textbooks, although I'll be pressing into service some of the elementary textbook constructions that are actually pretty true to Keynes today. Keynesian economics in the capital-based macroeconomic framework. And the context is the debate between Keynes and Hayek. I know you've heard a lecture, many of you have, from Peter Klein on the contribution of Hayek and sort of bibliographical information about Hayek, and he spent years at the London School of Economics and butted heads on more than one occasion with Keynes, failed to review the general theory for a number of reasons, including he was immersed in writing the Pure Theory of Capital. So out of that episode of Keynes versus Hayek, there never came any head-to-head comparison of the two schools of thought. There was snipings from both sides, critical reviews of one another books, and that sort of thing. But if you look through the literature of that period, or even the literature about that period, you won't find much in the way of taking the Austrian view and taking the Keynesian view, putting them head to head to see just where the differences are, just what changes have to be made to one theory to make it morph into the other theory. And in my way of thinking, that's a way to understand how the theories are different. If you start with one, what do you got to change to get the other one? If you can show that, what's the most minimum changes you can make and still get the conclusions of the other theory? That's a way of understanding both theories fairly well. Okay, and that's what I intend to do today. I want to put Keynes and Hayek head to head, and I'll start with Keynes because that's what many of you know because you took it in school or you teach it in school, and show how we can morph from there to the Hayekian view. And before I turn to the PowerPoint, I want to do a grease board exercise because it's got just a little bit of math in it, not much, but enough that you're more likely to follow it on the grease board than you are on the PowerPoint. So what I'll remind you of is that in the standard elementary level Keynesian presentations, we set out an income expenditure analysis. The economy settles into an equilibrium, not necessarily full employment, but settles into an equilibrium where all income gets spent, the income expenditure relationship. Income, that's Y. We don't use I for income because capitalized investment and little I is interest. Some students think we use Y for income because economists can't spell, and many of them can't, but Y is income. And income gets spent on consumer goods, that's C, investment goods, that's I, and whatever government buys, that's G. Now, to clean up the story a little bit, I'm going to throw G out. I want to work with a wholly private economy. It just keeps the math simpler, keeps the graphics simpler, and still does the trick. So, and it's kind of refreshing to be able to zero out government there anyhow. Okay, so G is 0, and you have the equilibrium condition is just income equals consumption plus investment. And if you remember your classes that start with these two equations, the next step, which is always the same in all the books, is to solve for the equilibrium level of income. Okay, if that's the consumption equation, and if that's the equilibrium condition, then for what value of Y is the economy in equilibrium? Well, we're not going to do that today. You've already done that. You've seen that. You know about that. We're not going to do that. I'm going to answer a different question that you never see answered or even asked in the principles books or in the lectures that you hear on Keynesian economics. I'm going to take those same two equations and ask what sort of a relationship does that imply between investment and consumption. We can answer that question simply by eliminating income from the equations, can't we? Well, let's do that, and I think it's very revealing. So the easy way to do it probably is just take this value of y, which is c plus I, and plug it in over here, and write c equals a plus b times c plus I. Okay? And I could work out the rest of the steps, but I'll let you do that on your own if you find a point in this lecture where you get bored with the lecture and you want to work out the equation. But if you simplify this then to say that c is some function of I, in other words, I need to get this c on the left side of the equation. And if I do that, I'll get this equation. I'll get c equals a over 1 minus b, a being simply the level of consumption associated with zero income, 1 minus b being the marginal propensity to save. B here is a marginal propensity to consume and is something less than 1. I didn't explain this because I assume most all of you know it, if you've had any economics at all. Plus b over 1 minus b times investment. Okay? So that equation, which derives directly from these two, it's just mathematically implied in those two, that equation tells you how c moves with I according to the Keynesian relationships. Okay? Now, that's very telling. It's very telling because look at this parameter, b over 1 minus b. We know that b, the marginal propensity to assume, might be what? 0.6, might be 0.8, 0.9. It's going to be positive. It's going to be something less than 1. And given it's in that range, then b over 1 minus b is going to be some positive amount. All right? So if b is 0.6, then you have 0.6 over 0.4, which is 1.5, positive amount. Any admissible value of b is going to give you a positive number, which means that on the ground floor and just by construction, in the Keynesian model, consumption and investment are constrained to move in the same direction. They don't move by the same amount because b is not 1. It's usually greater than 1. Okay? But they always move in the same direction. Now, what I would submit is that it follows from that almost trivially that the market can't possibly work right. Because anytime market conditions would suggest that there needs to be a trade-off between C and I, where you give up some of one in order to get more of the other, this equation is not going to handle it. You can't do it, okay, because they always move in the same direction. Now, what's amazing to me, as mathematical as economists are, that even at this elementary level, they would never report this in a textbook. I challenge you to find a principles text or an intermediate text that includes this equation and points out the significance. It's not there, okay? It's not there. Now, what I had hoped for myself, I published Time and Money in 2001, and this kind of analysis is central to one of the chapters on Keynes and Hayek. I had hoped that when my book came out, I would be the first macroeconomist to publish that simple equation in the book. That was my hope. Okay. Now, my hopes were dashed because the book came out. When I got my copy, I turned to page 136 where this equation I knew would appear, and it wasn't there. There was just a blank spot. Okay. It explains the importance of the equation, has a colon, leaves a blank spot for the equation, but it was gone. Okay. So I didn't succeed. It wasn't there. Okay. So still, you know, actually it showed up in the second printing after I had badgered Routledge for a while and told them they need to put this equation in. But I think it may be the only equation in the book. It's not quite right, but it's almost the only equation in the book, and it got left out. So if you have an old copy of Time and Money, that's the equation that you need to put in at that point. But the lesson we get from it is that in the Keynesian system, C and I always move together, up and down together. All right. Now we'll see that in the PowerPoint show, both in terms of the graphics and in terms of some of Keynes' prose. Keynes never actually drew the graph. He never actually wrote the equation, but he talked us through it. Okay. We'll find a passage where He tried to simplify things. He assumed that A was 0 just for purposes of simplification, and then talked us through this equation, which I call, by the way, I call it the Keynesian demand constraint, for lack of a better name for it. It means the economy always has to move along a line that's given by that equation. Okay, let me turn to the PowerPoint, and I'll give you a little bit of an overview about Austrians, Keynesians, and monetarists so you can see where I'm going, because in a lecture tomorrow I'll be focusing more on monetarists than on the Keynesians. According to Keynes, markets don't work, and really how could they? If a sort of fundamental structure of the economy precludes there being any trade-off between these two kinds of economic activities. Markets don't work, and especially, according to Keynes, especially the loanable funds market. That's the supply and demand for loanable funds that supposedly governs the interest rate, and that he actually threw that one out because he was convinced it didn't work. If we look at the monetarist counter-revolution, we see Milton Friedman making a different claim, and it's that markets do work, but never mind the loanable funds market. In other words, that doesn't get featured in Friedman's work or even presented. Okay, it's not there. In fact, as we'll see, the level of aggregation in Friedman's work suppresses any discussion of allocation of resources between consumption and investment. He talks holistically in terms of output, okay, of both consumption and investment. And the Austrian contracts, of course, that's Hayek here, markets work, even the loanable funds market. All right, so that's the position I wanted to defend, that markets work, even the loanable funds market, to allocate resources between investment and consumption. Just to elaborate a little bit here, and you'll see how it shows up in the graphs later, you can see why Keynes took the position he did, given his view of saving and investment, because he says saving is based on habit, well, and income. In other words, habitually people spend a certain portion of their income given by a saving equation that most of you have seen, which is derived directly from the consumption equation. It's what's left out of income after you've done your consumption. And it's all a matter of habit, okay? It tends not to change over time. So saving is a matter of habit, where investment is based on, well, you could use different terms, state of confidence in the economy, the level of optimism in the economy, fire in the belly of the business community, or Keynes himself used the term animal spirits. He used that term 3 times in a page and a half, which leads you to believe he means it. You know, that's the key to investment. It's based on psychology. Let's go back to that. So you have income expenditure analysis. Income expenditure, just Y equals C plus I, which takes a depressed economy to be the general case. That equilibrium doesn't imply full employment. You could be in a so-called unemployment equilibrium, according to Keynes. And if it shows anything, it simply shows how a bad situation can get worse or how a good situation can get better. The economy can spiral up or spiral down, increasing or decreasing levels of employment, but is unlikely to settle in on the full employment level of income. It might, but only by accident, Keynes said, or design, by which he means well-prescribed monetary and fiscal policies. Now I'll show you a graph that should be familiar to most of you, and it's simply the income expenditure graph, and I start out with consumption expenditures on the vertical axis, income on the horizontal axis, and I'm just going to graph a consumption equation. I'll put a 45-degree line in there just as a reference point right now. And there's a particular consumption equation, a particular C equals A plus B Y. Looks like A is about 200 and B, the slope of that line, is about 2/3. You can write the equation that C equals A plus BY, or C equals 200 plus 2/3 Y. And I'll just kind of squinch it up there in the corner because I want to put some more stuff on the screen. That's the same thing, just scaled down a little bit. And right now I don't have any investment in there at all. And if we were to assume that investment is 0, then of course the equilibrium would be at a point where Y equals C. And that would be the point where that consumption equation cuts the 45-degree line. wouldn't it? Okay, if you set y equal to c, that's the point that you would get. So the intersection of the consumption equation, the 45-degree line, represents an income expenditure equilibrium. Okay, yes, but only if investment spending is zero. So let's let investment spending be zero initially, and then I want to increase investment spending, supposedly on the basis of increased confidence or optimism or whatever in the economy, and show successive equilibria at different levels of investment. But I want to keep track of it in two ways. Let me show you. Initially, that point is the equilibrium point because investment is zero. So I write I equals zero and identify that point. Now, on this slide, what I want to do is keep track of consumption and investment in two different ways. One is by piling investment on top of consumption. That's sort of the Keynesian thing to do. I and C are additive. You just add them up as two different kinds of investment. But I also want to keep track of it like the Austrians do as alternative ways of using resources. So I need another graph that I can put there on the right. And it's a graph that you've seen before, at least you've seen the axis before, where I put consumption on the vertical axis, investment on the horizontal, okay? And I can even identify this point. Look here, if I get my arrow going here. That point looks like about 600 consumption, but it's zero investment. So if I traced over here, it would be that point right there. See there? That's how it works. So that's the point on that curve. Now, let's let investment be something. Okay, there's a fire in the belly, animal spirits investment is 200 or so instead of zero. And the Keynesian graph looks like that. Now you pile that investment, which itself doesn't depend on current income. That's why it's parallel to C. You pile that on top of consumption, and you get a higher level of equilibrium. All right. This is straight out of the principles textbooks. But now, if I wanted to trace over here, where's that point over here? Well, there's the equilibrium. For that level of equilibrium, that is the level of consumption right there, isn't it? And at that level of consumption, we have, well, investment of 200. So I simply come over here. That looks like about 200 right there. That gives me another point. You see how that works? And so by continuing to increase the level of investment, I can continue to derive points on the relationship that's going to be in that on that right-hand side. Let's go on up. There's 400 of investment. If I trace that over, I'm going to end up over here somewhere. Okay. Let's do 600. Okay. That's going to put me. Well, that thing's linear, so it's got to be moving along up that way. Okay. We got room for another one. Okay, there's another one. How about one more? Okay. All right, so 6 points are enough to determine a straight line, with 4 to spare, right? Now, you see two things here. You see, at least in the right-hand diagram, you see it emphasized that C and I move up and down together. They're positively sloped. There's no trade-off between them. Also, you see that if it hadn't been for the particular limits of my graph, you know, where I have to whack the thing off and quit adding points, it just goes on forever. There's nothing in the diagram as it's currently presented to show you how much of consumption and investment we can generate. Okay, it just goes on forever. In the textbook, we learned that we have to identify some level of income that we take to be full employment. And when we've identified that, then we take it that if you push beyond full employment, well, you're really not going to get more output, you're just going to get more expensive output. In other words, prices go up rather than quantities. All right? But that particular point doesn't come out of this graph, so it has to be put into the graphs. You have to add to see where the level of full employment is. And for Keynes, for certainly textbook Keynesianism, they would simply identify a level of income for which the labor market is clearing at some established wage rate. In the Austrian view, we'd identify a full employment level of output by a production possibilities frontier. All right. So if I slap a production possibilities frontier on that right-hand diagram, That'll tell me whether I've still got some to go to get up to full employment, or am I at full employment? Have I already gone past full employment? Right now we can't tell, but when I put the PPF on there, we can. Okay. Well, let me make a straight line out of this thing. And that's the line, by the way. Can you guess what the equation of that line is? So we're on the board, isn't it? C equals A over 1 minus B plus B over 1 minus B times I. All I've done really is derive that same relationship graphically. And here I do it on the board, which is the same thing I did on the grease board. That's why I wanted to do it on the grease board, because you don't like to have to follow the math that's in that stuff. So using the 202/3, the equation of that line is C equals 600 plus 2 times I, or more generally, in terms of A's and B's, it looks like that, and that's certainly what's on the board over there. So that's the Keynesian demand constraint. Okay. Now I see what I'm doing here. What I want to do here is show that Keynes himself recognized this relationship, but somehow Keynesian scholars and certainly textbooks have overlooked it. And the passage I'm going to present comes out of Keynes' 1937 article, the year after the book was published, where he summarized, his title of that article was The General Theory of Employment, as opposed to the book, which is General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. So in the General Theory of Employment, it's actually the working title of his book. The rest got added later, but in that article, he wrote some prose that lines up perfectly with the equation. So we're going to let A, which is the intercept of that consumption function, be 0, just to make things simple for ourselves, because that's what Keynes was doing, and let B equal 0.9. So 1 over 1 minus B would be what? 1 over 1 minus 0.9, 1 over 0.1, okay, be about 10. B over 1 minus B, that's what we want to go for, isn't it? This B over 1 minus B is going to be 0.9 over 1 minus 0.9, which equals 9. Okay, that's what we want. Now here's what Keynes says. He says, if, for example, the public are in the habit of spending 9/10 of their income on consumption goods, and you notice spending is a habit, it follows that if entrepreneurs were to produce consumption goods at a cost more than 9 times the cost of the investment goods they are producing, some part of their output could not be sold at a price which covered the cost of production. He says the formula is not, of course, quite so simple as in this illustration, and of course it's not because he made A equal 0 and we've let A equal be some positive number. But there's always a formula, more or less of this kind, relating the output of consumption goods, which it pays to produce, to the output of investment goods. This conclusion appears to me to be quite beyond dispute, yet the consequences which follow from it are at the same time unfamiliar and of the greatest possible importance. Right? So what he's saying there is that you got to pay attention to this relationship between investment and consumption is upward sloping, and people aren't paying attention to that, and yet it has tremendous importance. Well, of course, it does have tremendous importance for Keynes. It means markets can't work. Okay, it means you can't trade one off against the other, and that you need policy to get you to full employment. Okay, at this point now, I want to carry along the loanable funds diagram, even though Keynes threw it out. I'm not going to be untrue to Keynes because I'll be able to illustrate just why he threw it out. Let me drop, let's see, okay, these things are positive related. Oh, I see. Is this last point below, at, or above full employment? I hadn't dealt with that issue yet. Well, let's put the PPF on there. There it is. So you can see at this, I've already pushed past full employment. I'm out in some inflationary range beyond full employment. And so what I want to do is just realign it with full employment. I'm going to back investment off a little bit here, where I get a fully employed economy as just a starting point for the analysis. Okay, so the economy is fully employed. Now, Keynes wouldn't have measured the full employment that way. What he would have done is look at the different levels of income and see what the labor market looks like. The Keynesians would show full employment as a labor market that clears at the going wage rate. Okay, so let's check and see if that's full employment. Pull down our labor market, and sure enough, the labor market clears at the going wage rate. Also, what we'll see with Keynes is that, and this is typical of the Keynesian system, is that the going wage rate keeps going even after the market conditions that gave rise to it are gone. Okay, so which is another way of saying wages are sticky downwards. They tend not to change in the face of market conditions. Now I bring down the loanable funds market to show that that market too is clearing. Looks like at about a 5% rate of interest. And I'll show you later about the graph in Keynes' book, which lines up perfectly with our loanable funds market. So the Keynes theory focuses on the balance between income and expenditures, and not on the PPF and not on the loanable funds market. So what I want to do now is clean up this diagram and show you a depression in the Keynesian view. And I'll show it to you in sort of in 3 takes, so you look for a different thing each time. And then I'll be able to show you what modifications we need to make in order to get the economy actually to work right. All right. We'll back it up to just the simple principles level presentation, C plus I. And the kind of questions that Keynes is able to answer, but put our labor market there. Let's let investment fall because of a waning of animal spirits. This is a typical classroom exercise. You happen to be at full employment, okay, lucky you. Your luck probably won't hold out. Why not? Well, because pessimism may eventually take over the business community, investment may fall, and the economy will spiral downwards to an unemployment equilibrium. And so we ask the question, there you see investment falling. You see C plus I now is lower than it was. So that equilibrium point is now hollow, is a disequilibrium point. The economy, you know, is going to spiral down to that point. Okay. What happens then? And of course, the answer is the economy crashes. I think I said yesterday that almost no matter what happens, the economy crashes because wages and prices and the interest rate are all governed by some pre-existing condition that no longer applies. So watch the economy crash. There it goes. Okay. It crashes. You're at a lower level of income, lower level of investment, lower level of spending. Right. Look at labor markets. The demand for labor has fallen, but not the wage rate because it's sticky downwards. That's the going wage that keeps going. All right. The economy crashes. Okay. Now what I want you to do is watch it again. I'm going to show you the same thing, but this time keep an eye on the PPF diagram. You know what's happening with that first diagram. You've already seen that. And I'm going to show the same sequence there, and of course you should be able to anticipate what's going to happen. Again, you see the investment falling just like it did before. The economy is going to crash. It's going to go to here. But what's going to happen over there? It moves along that Keynesian demand constraint. That's the only place it can move. That constraint is sort of the locus of points that are possible within the Keynesian framework. All right? So it moves along that demand constraint inside the PPF. Okay, and now we're going to do it again, but this time keeping track of the loanable funds market. So I'll bring down the loanable funds market. Okay, and here when I show the decrease in investment, I'll have to show that decrease in investment in 2 ways. One is like I've shown it before, the C plus I drops because I is now less than it was. But also if there's a fall in investment, that's represented by a fall in the demand for investment funds. So demand for investment funds is going to shift to the left, isn't it? Reduced demand for investment funds and reduced investment. Okay, let's watch that. There it is. There's a decrease in investment. And let's hold it at that point for just a minute to see what might conceivably happen, or you might think would happen, If you look at that loanable funds market, you think, well, demand for investment goods has fallen, and that drives the interest rate down. You can see it would. The interest rate would come down to here. And with low interest rates, people wouldn't be willing to save quite so much. They'd be moving down their supply curve, and they'd be down here. If they're not saving as much, it means they're spending more on consumption goods, all right, which creates a demand to produce consumption goods, all right? So this would be perfectly consistent with the parametric change. Suppose investors are no longer willing to put up with all the uncertainties associated with investment, so they back off, freeing up resources to be used in the consumer goods industry. And the lower interest rate is what encourages people to consume more because it discourages them from saving, all right? That could happen. That could happen. That would be the market at work. But that doesn't happen. In fact, this is Keynes' point. Before that even gets a chance to happen, the market process is cut short, is preempted by, guess what? A crashing of the economy. Okay, the economy crashes and locks you into an unemployment equilibrium. Let's watch that. And again, you know what happens here, and you know what happens over here, so watch down here to see what happens. Okay, saving shifts too, all right? And you can see why, because income has fallen. All right, the economy has spiraled down to where income is down at this level instead of at the full employment level. At a lower level of income, people save less. And you show that by shifting of the supply curve to the left, and Keynes would have it that the supply will shift by the same amount as a shift in demand, such that the interest rate is not changed. All right, that was his point. In fact, to show the sort of authenticity of this view, I brought in a copy of the general theory and invite you, if you haven't thumbed through the book before, if you thumb through it, you'll see no graphs, okay, at all. No graphs at all, except for one. Except for one is on page 180. Might not be able to see it from the back or even from the front, but this is the graph. That's the graph. And if you look at this graph and work with it and see what it says exactly the same thing and is constructed for exactly the same purpose as my loanable funds graph there. So Keynes did use loanable funds theory, but only to show how futile it was to try to keep track of the interest rate with it, because he says if both curves shift by the same amount, then the interest rate doesn't change, and therefore loanable funds theory can't explain what the interest rate is. You need something else to explain what the interest rate is, which turned out, of course, to be his liquidity preference theory of interest. But his whole point, the only difference here is that for some reason he reverses the axis. He's got the interest rate on the horizontal axis, and he's got saving and investment on the vertical axis, although he fails to label those. Okay, you got an axis there with no label. Now, to me, that has the effect of fingernail scratching on the blackboard. Okay, label your axes. But that's what's on the axis. And so you actually have to turn to page 179, hold the book sideways and hold it up to the light, and you'll see it's the same diagram as I have up there. Okay, so the economy crashes once again. So you see the interest rate doesn't fall. The interest rate, which you thought was going to fall, doesn't fall at all, because the spiraling downward reduces income, reduces saving, and makes that old interest rate, again, the market clearing rate. Right? So now the market is clearing all the way around, except, of course, the labor market, which is showing the unemployment. That's the unemployment equilibrium. So the equilibrium is here, here. See, Keynes counts that as an equilibrium because you're on that demand constraint. That's an equilibrium. It's equilibrium all around except here, but you can't do without that because the wage rate doesn't change. It's fixed. It's sticky downwards. Okay. All right. Now, so far I've stuck not only with the Keynesian analytics, just expounding by using these other diagrams, and I've also stuck with the reason for the economy sinking into depression that was suggested by Keynes. He says that the primary reason for economy crashing into depression is a waning of the animal spirits. There's a collapse, he says, in the demand for investment funds. He calls it the marginal efficiency of capital. Okay, you have a collapse in that investment sector, and that throws the economy into recession. But the way to pit Keynes against Hayek is to show what happens when the level of savings change. Because that's what Hayek worked with, changes in savings preferences. And then he played that off with changes in credit policy to give you the business cycle. All right. Keynes realized that the economy would be in trouble if the rate of savings increased. That was his paradox of thrift. He didn't spend much time explaining or worrying about that because he didn't think it was a problem. He didn't think savings did change. You don't have to worry about people wanting to save more. They don't. Okay. They're creatures of habit when it comes to dividing their income between consumption and saving. So don't worry about the paradox of thrift. Although, if you want to worry about it, well, you can see that if saving increases, the economy crashes. So let's see how that works. Here I'm showing an increase in saving, and I show it in two ways. One is increase in saving means a decrease in consumption, doesn't it? So that consumption equation shifts down, and with it C plus I. Not that I itself changed, but I was sitting on top of C. So if C shifts down, then C plus I shifts down. You can see where the economy is going to be headed down there. And yet over here I've shown that, okay, savings increases, that's an outward shift in the savings equation. All right? So that's a hypothetical reference change that we're going to deal with and see how it becomes paradoxical. Well, one thing I can point out, that if that consumption function actually shifts, then the A term is reduced, isn't it? The intercept is reduced. It looks like it's reduced all the way to zero, but at least it's reduced. So that means even this Keynesian demand constraint will change. It will shift too. I probably should go ahead and shift it now, but it shifts with the rest of everything else. So that demand constraint, as far as Keynes was concerned, is stable. It sits there. It's as immovable as A and B are constant. And Keynes thought that A and B were pretty constant. But if people really increase their saving, that means that A falls. The intercept falls. And if it falls, then the Keynesian demand constraint falls. So you'll see some movement in the constraint itself. But what you'll look for here then is that when I pull the trigger again, let's see, you note that the A in C equals A plus BY has decreased. Yeah, okay, we got that. Which means that the demand constraint will shift down. Okay. So when I pull the trigger again, then the economy goes into depression. Income falls, and when income falls, savings is reduced. Even though you see the whole thing is set off by people trying to save more, the earning less causes them to reduce their saving. So let's watch it, and then we can explain what's going on. Okay. Once again, the economy crashes. Okay. So now you can see what's happened. You're right back at this underemployment equilibrium. The demand constraint itself is lower simply because one of the parameters, A, has changed. So you're still inside the frontier now at this point. If you look at the savings curve, you see it's going first one way and then the other. It shifts out due to the preference change. It shifts back because income fell. All right? And that's the paradox. That's why he called it the paradox of thrift. In trying to save more so you can consume more in the future, the real consequence, according to him, is that you don't save more, but rather earn less out of which to save. Okay, so it impinges on income rather than on savings per se. So once again, the economy crashes. And here I just repeat Keynes' paradox of thrift, but I've already shown you this once, if not twice. So again, it just reminds you how definite and extreme a statement that is. Every attempt to save more by reducing consumption will so affect incomes that the attempt necessarily defeats itself. So he's saying it's necessarily the case that you end up saving no more than before for reasons that are spelled out there in the graphs. And that's right out of the general theory. Okay. Now, to resolve the paradox, what we need to do is outfit the model with an intertemporal structure of production. That's the Hayekian triangle. And we need to get more than just one labor market. Okay, we need to get stage-specific labor markets. But I want to do this resolution in 2 steps. Let me show you how to do it. Okay, and let me back up. You see the triangle there. Let's go back. Look at this. Look at this diagram here, and you can see the level of consumption is the vertical distance from here up to the consumption equation, isn't it? That's consumption. Okay, so when I go to the triangle, then that distance is going to be that vertical segment of the Hayekian triangle. Okay, and that's the vertical segment of the Hayekian triangle. So we're picturing the same economy, but now we're recognizing that that output of consumption is a result of a sequence of inputs, a sequence of stages of production. And in an ongoing market process, each of those stages are in operation at any given point in time and can be affected by changes in interest rates and so on. Okay? Now recognize that labor markets in the late stages and early stages operate differentially, so I want to carry along 2 labor markets. All right? So now I've got the system outfitted with the Hayekian analytics, and what I do next is once again posit an increase in saving, and now to show my increase in saving, I just show that increase in saving like that. The saving shifts rightward, and when I pull the trigger again, here's what I want it to do. I wanted to show the response in the Hayekian framework, but with all the Keynesian assumptions. Okay, so let's stay with Keynes for a minute. The economy is going to spiral down. It's going to crash. Okay, but and so we've just got Hayek here watching it, tracking it with his own apparatus. Okay, and so let's watch it crash. Okay, there it crashed. And so you can see the same thing as before with the paradox of Thrift, except now we're showing crashes at each and every stage of production. Okay, so crashing all along the way, and we can show that labor markets, whether early stage or late stage, both experienced a decrease in demand, and both are showing unemployment. This is consistent with Keynes' general theory. All you have to do is incorporate his chapter 4 with the paradox of Thrift, because in chapter 4 he assumes a fixed structure of industry. Everything is sort of hamstrung. It's in a straitjacket. It can't change in relative sizes. So it can either stay at full employment or lapse from full employment or try to push beyond full employment, which gives you inflation. But there's no scope for movements within that structure at all. And finally, all I need to do is do this one more time. Okay. So I'm back to the original Hayekian view. Let savings increase, like so, and pull the trigger again, and then free up the economy from those artificial assumptions made by Keynes. In other words, the structure is not fixed. It can change. Resources can move between stages. Labor markets can operate differentially. This interest rate effect down here, this lower interest rate, does have an effect on investment and on the pattern of investment. So now you finally get the healthy growth of the economy as for the first time you move along. See, we've been Keynesian from the start, so we've been doing nothing but move along that Keynesian demands constraint. And now I've freed up the economy enough that it can actually move along the production possibilities frontier. And of course it does it by reallocating labor from the late stages of production to the early stages of production. So you get reductions for sure, just like Keynes thought you would in the late stages, because consumption is down, saving is up. But just as surely you get increases in economic activity at the early stages that are inspired by the low interest rates and the availability of resources for those purposes. So in my view, that resolves the paradox of Thrift, and certainly in favor of Hayek, in showing that if you put all the market forces fully in play, that you get that result and not some paradoxical result that leaves you at unemployment. Okay. That's the end of that show. Well, for the first time, I do have some time for questions about this and possible discussion. So let me open it up at this point for discussion or questions or comments. Yes?
What is the major policy suggestion of Keynesian economy?
What's the major?
Policy suggestion.
Policy prescription?
Yes.
Well, you know, it depends on how you read Keynes. And like I say, I like to go to general theory directly to get my policy prescription. Keynes had two sets of recommendations. And in Time and Money, I deal with this in two separate chapters. In one chapter, I deal with the problem of business cycles, and I call it cyclical unemployment and policy prescription. And in that chapter, it's more the standard Keynes, it's the textbook Keynes, where Keynes sees a big role for government to come in and stimulate the economy to get it to full employment, either by spending or by cutting taxes or some combination of the two. This is the aspect of Keynes that later got developed by Abba Lerner, where he called it functional finance. In other words, the government shouldn't spend just because it needs to build a road. It should spend in order to affect the level of employment, or it should cut taxes in order to affect the level of spending. All right. But if you read Keynes as I do, and which I think of as just a straightforward reading, he sees those fiscal fixes, which he wants to be accompanied by monetary fixes too. He saw the monetary theory as sort of a second fiddle to the fiscal policy. He sees those as helpful to try to keep the economy afloat, to keep it from crashing altogether long enough to institute some more meaningful reform. All right? So if you get to the end of the book, chapter 24, which changes in tone, it sounds like it's a revelation according to John. I mean, it's really mystical stuff if you read that chapter 24. And there, he realizes that, okay, we've got this system that's inherently flawed, and it's going to cycle up and down, booms and busts, animal spirits, fire in the belly, and all this stuff. And we need all of the forces of government at work to try to smooth it out, but how long can that last? He hopes we can smooth it out long enough that we can usher in some more meaningful reform. And the best summary of the meaningful reform comes in chapter 24. A comment he makes that has been up for a lot of interpreting, but it's a comment I don't think needs all that much interpreting. I mean, it says what it says. And here, it's here that Keynes says, I see no solution to our contemporary problems short of a comprehensive socialization of investment activity. Okay? That's what he says in chapter 24. And scholars have written a lot of articles to figure out just what Keynes meant by comprehensive socialization of investment activity. Well, I think I know. I don't think it needs that much interpreting. But that's a chapter where he talks about the euthanasia of the rentier. You know, we need to put these capitalist pigs, he doesn't use the word pig, we need to put these capitalists out of their misery and put the state in a position of directing investment activity. He even says in an earlier chapter that the state is in a better position to take the long-run view. All right? And he sees it taking a much greater role in investment. Yes?
So investment only matters as far as the amount?
Yeah. In fact, here he gets criticism from people like Joan Robinson that, again, in chapter 24, he makes it clear, even by using some italics. He says, I'm not complaining about the direction of investment, but only the amount of investment activity. And direction and amount are in italics. And so he imagines that he says the market does a reasonable job of allocating the resources that it does allocate, but unfortunately, in times of depression, it leaves a lot of resources unallocated, idle resources, unemployment, depression. So we need, whether it's policies or social reform, we need somehow to increase the total level of activity so we have full employment, but somehow letting the market to continue to work to allocate among the various goods and services. And he never specified just how you could do that. And in fact, some of his critics, he gets critics from both sides, from both right and left, because Joan Robertson, who eventually became a Marxist, sort of chided Keynes for confining his focus to the amount, because she thought the direction needed some guidance too, okay, that the economy doesn't even produce the kind of goods we want. We need government in there to direct it in a micro level as well. And of course the critique coming from the market-oriented economists is simply that Keynes pointed out no policy measures that could possibly affect the level of activity without also affecting the direction, and probably for the worse. Okay. Other question? Yeah.
Is the key insight between standard Keynesian view and the one that you present here just that consumption and investment are trade-off?
Well, that's the way you do the morphing from the Keynesian view to the Austrian view. That it's amazing how the textbooks, you have these big, thick macro textbooks that cost $100 or whatever they do. In the first chapter or two, you usually see a production possibilities frontier. But you get back to the macro chapters and the thing is gone, never to appear. And yet, if the student is at all insightful, he'll wonder whatever happened to that PPF and how can it be reconciled with this Keynesian stuff. But the textbooks don't even so much as point out that the production possibilities frontier has been abandoned. It's no longer in play at all. And what I'm pointing out is that it's not in play in the Keynesian view. It is in play in the Austrian view, and it comes into play by attention to the various stages of production that make up that structure of production and the differential effects that changes in the interest rate have on that structure. It's how you move along the production possibilities frontier. So sort of a summary judgment here is that Keynes never explains how in the world an economy could conceivably work right. But he doesn't explain it because he doesn't think it could ever conceivably work right. Okay? And somehow that's lost in the textbooks too. Let me make one point that, and I'll come back to a question here. It's absolutely amazing how much literature there is on interpreting Keynes. It's a never-ending industry. What did Keynes really mean? And part of the controversy is what he meant by his title. There's even articles about what Keynes meant by his title, the general theory. The title doesn't say anything about policy. Is this really just a theoretical book and not a policy book? Why didn't he mention policy? And it turns out, does anyone know where the title of the general theory of employment came from? His working title for the book was the general theory of employment. Only at the end did the interest and money get tacked on. And it turns out that Keynes was a great admirer of Albert Einstein. And Einstein actually came to some of Keynes' lectures. And Einstein was an admirer of Keynes. I've got one passage in one of my articles that quotes Einstein on the problems of the economy, and it sounds like Keynes. Okay? And so what's going on here is that Keynes is simply cribbing a title from Einstein. Instead of the general theory of relativity, it's the general theory of employment. This was not lost on the early reviewers. When Cecil Pigou reviewed the general theory, he says in his review that, well, Maynard thinks he's done for economics what Einstein actually did do for physics. And somehow through the years that connection has gotten lost. But that's where the title of the general theory. You see, he gets criticized for calling it a general theory rather than some kind of a tract for the times. But the significance of the title tells you more about Keynes' view of himself than it tells you about what he thought was actually in the book. Yeah.
I heard that people usually call neo-Keynesian economy. There are some recent neo-Keynesian economy. And even people call Joseph Stiglitz like neo-Keynesian economy.
Yeah. In fact, these days, all those people, I mean, there are, think about it, there are neo-Keynesians and there are new Keynesians. Those are two different schools. Okay, what does neo mean now? Let's see. Isn't it new? Okay. So, and most of the Keynesians we have today, I call them adjectival Keynesians. You know, they always have, there's some adjective there and then Keynesian, which have very little relationship to Keynes. You have to go back and get your Keynes from the general theory. There's even, there are two schools, one post-Keynesian, okay, and there's another school called post-Keynesian, but it has a hyphen in it. Okay, post-Keynesian and post-Keynesian, which is different than either neo-Keynesian or new Keynesian. And I was at a conference a few years ago when one of the speakers referred to himself, you see, with the hyphen in print, you know, you put the hyphen in, everybody can see it and they know what it means, or they're supposed to. But one speaker identified himself as an unhyphenated post-Keynesian. And most of the speakers were either neo-Keynesians, post-Keynesians, or unhyphenated post-Keynesian. And when I finally got to the podium, I introduced myself as an unhyphenated Austrian. And they wanted to know, where does the hyphen not go? But there's a lot of, and most of the adjectives, you know, this kind of Keynesian, that kind of Keynesian, are just trading on Keynes' name and reputation for what that's worth, without having necessarily any huge direct link to Keynes' general theory. How many in here have read Keynes' general theory? Okay. It's an experience trying to get through the book. Any other questions?
What's the counter Hayek read?
Well, it would be Prices in Production. Prices in Production, which was written actually before General Theory. It's written in 31, 35 is the second edition. Okay. So that would be it. Yes?
What's the difference between all the different Keynesian schools?
What the difference between the... well, typically neo-Keynesian is used to mean Keynes plus quite a little bit of classical theory added in to establish the full employment level of income. Because Keynes actually, even though he calls it general theory, he doesn't have a general theory of full employment. There's nothing in his book to tell you about how labor markets work or how they settle, you know, where full employment is. The new Keynesians are simply new classical economists who believe that wages are sticky. You know, post-Keynesians are economists who read a lot of the Marxist stuff into Keynes. There's a pretty hefty dose of Marxism in Keynes, and the post-Keynesians embrace a lot of that. Okay, well, thank you very much.